Okay, welcome everyone to the HAI Weekly Research Seminar. For people in the back, consider moving up so we can interact with you a bit more. I am Ashish Goyal. I'm Professor of Management Science and Engineering and by courtesy Computer Science here at Stanford. I conduct research in the design, analysis, and application of algorithms, which is exactly the topic that David analyzes, but from a different angle. I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker, David Robinson. David is a visiting scholar at the Social Science Matrix at the University of California, Berkeley. He's also a member of the faculty at Apple University. At Apple, he teaches seminars at the intersection of technology and the liberal arts. And interestingly, that's one way Steve Jobs used to describe Apple, a company at the intersection of technology and the liberal arts. David also advises and consults on making inclusive products at Apple. He co-founded and led Upturn in an earlier life, an NGO that partners with civil rights organizations to advance equity and justice in the design, governance, and use of digital technology. And recently, quite interestingly, he has also spent time at the White House helping craft the recently released Bill of Rights. In today's seminar, he'll discuss his new book, Voices in the Code, which tells the story of how one community built a life and death algorithm in an inclusive, accountable way. It's a positive example, which is rare in this area, so that's fantastic. Before we begin, a few logistics. For a Zoom audience, you can use the Zoom chat to message the group, but ask all your questions through Sildo. There's going to be a link on the chat, not Sildo, Slido. Slido has a nice upvote feature, which will help me prioritize questions. Keep your questions to the end of the seminar. If you have something really pressing, you can ask in the middle. But as moderator, I might sort of say, okay, no, let's defer it to the end. After the presentation, we'll be switching off between questions from a live audience, questions from a virtual audience, and a question from me. So without further ado, let's welcome David and take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Ashish. Thanks, everybody here and everyone. Look, online, wherever online is. It's a real pleasure to be here and to share this work with you, and I look forward to our discussion. Let's get right into it. Our story begins at this airport Marriott in Dallas, Texas, on a chilly morning in February of 2007. A crowd of several hundred people have gathered inside for the first preview of a new and life-saving software product, something that's been in the works for several years. These people have come together to consider a new version of the algorithm. Virtual people, your questions will be read and considered. Right, these people, hundreds of people in this Marriott have come together to consider a new version of the software that decides whenever a donated kidney becomes available anywhere in the United States, which of about 100,000 waiting transplant patients should be offered the chance to receive that organ. Even though the previous generation of this software is already in use and saving lives, many in the room are harshly critical of what's been shipped. They think this time they can do better. They're passionately dedicated to getting things right, both ethically and technologically. And they know that in order for their efforts to succeed, a huge number of people out there living their lives are going to have to understand and trust the way that this technology works. Now, the situation happening in Dallas, this algorithm to allocate kidneys, and this is a public meeting, this very public process that's dealing with the ethics inside of this software comes from a long history of experts sharing the moral burden of their decision-making with the rest of a wider community. And that tradition actually began here in 1960 with Teflon, the same chemical that's on the nonstick pans that we used to use. So just a little bit of background. Kidneys play a lot of important roles in the body. The conventionally primary one that's described is that they filter toxins out of our blood. And ever since World War II, actually, in Holland, physicians had known that you could take blood out of someone's body and filter it by machine and put it back in if they didn't have working kidneys, and this would be a way to keep them alive. But there was a real problem, which was the same problem that injecting drug users eventually developed, which is that when you use a big needle, it leaves a scar, and there's only so many places that you can do that. And so people who didn't have working kidneys before this moment, they could get dialysis, but they could only get it for about a month before they would run out of places to have the needle. So that's where this nonstick Teflon tubing that you see diagrammed here came in and made a huge difference, because when you leave a small shunt made out of this nonstick material in somebody's arm, you can give them dialysis over and over. And this was a time before transplants were routine. Basically, I mean, there was a famous case, the Herrick twins, identical twins, same immune system, and one was able to give a kidney to another. We all have two kidneys, you know that, right? So you can do transplants, and the surgery piece had been figured out many years before. The hard part was the immunology, finding someone where you could give them, or a way to treat them where you could give them someone else's kidney and they wouldn't attack it as something foreign to their body. But instead it would continue to work for them. Anyway, that was unsolved. We knew how to do dialysis, but we could only do it for a short time. Then this tube comes in. Suddenly, anyone who needs dialysis can receive the treatment over and over. Potentially, they can be kept alive for a very long time through that technique. But the person who invented this shunt, a guy named Belding Scribner in University of Washington, Seattle, he had a problem. Many, many patients at any given time had kidney failure, but he only had 4 dialysis machines. And so at that time, with the state of the art, they could keep alive maybe a dozen, 15 people. He was inundated with calls when this was published from dying patients, from their physicians saying, you know, can you save me? I think I'm doubly mic'd here and it's echoing. Can we turn this one off? I don't know. Anyway, great. Okay, on we go. So the thing is, so he said, all right, I've got a few slots, right? What does a patient want to do? Patient wants to save every life that they can. Patient does not want to say, you're more valuable than you are, I'm going to save you. That's not how the medical profession wants to relate to people in medical need. And so Scribner makes, at this point, in trying to decide who should get dialysis, he makes a radical, and as it turns out, a very high impact decision. He goes to the local medical society and says, look, we'll do our best for whoever ends up using our dialysis machines, but there's so many more patients who could be saved by this treatment than I can treat, that really the question of which person should be saved, that's not a medical choice. That belongs to a wider community. And so they get a group of lay people who you see depicted here. This is a Shana Alexander story. She was an eminent journalist. And they're in shadow, but as you can see, there was only one woman on this group in the center holding the reading glasses in her clasped hands. You can see clerical collar of a Roman Catholic priest. These people were anonymous. This did not go over well. It seemed too ad hoc. Based on the reporting, it seemed that this committee liked income earners with families to support men in those years. A couple of scholars wrote, the Pacific Northwest is no place for a Henry David Thoreau with bad kidneys, right? Because they wouldn't pick someone creative or nonconformist, the thought was, to receive the treatment. So a lot to dislike about Dr. Scribner's approach here, and a lot of public controversy. But there was also something profoundly honest about it. And the principles that seemed to underpin this effort, and which remained important decades later, the technology might be complex, but the hard ethical choices belong to a wider community. not just to the technical experts. And by the way, in order to get the ethical input that we need, it's necessary to bring lay people into the fold and to brief and educate them. So these people, for example, were told, here's what it takes to do well on dialysis. They weren't told, here's how you should pick which people to save, right? But they were told, here's how this technology works and what you need to know about it. And a long tradition follows this. Years later, Congress in 1972 decides that dialysis should be provided for everyone who needs it, which is sort of one very expensive, but very simple way out of the trap of needing to decide who should get dialysis. And we still have that regime today. But later, transplant emerges as a better way of treating kidney failure than dialysis. If you can have someone else's kidney working inside you and live a healthy life, not have to spend 12 hours a week hooked up to a machine, not have to yo-yo through good and ill health over the course of hours and days every week. By the way, 20% of people who start dialysis are dead within a year. Part of that is because people who need dialysis aren't completely healthy in the first place. That's part of the definition of what it is to need dialysis. But another part is that dialysis is a risky procedure where there are infection risks, things can go wrong any number of ways. So receiving a transplant is a much, much better outcome if you're able to do that. But just like there weren't enough dialysis machines when this committee was created, there aren't today enough kidneys to go around. And so Congress created, in the words of its statute, the National Organ Transplantation Act, a national system through the use of computers, i.e. an algorithm, they directed that such a thing should be built to decide who should get the available organs. And then there was a task force that said, okay, we should really get public input in how that matching happens and what the priorities are. And they did. And over time, the system evolved so that the primary factor that was being used by the time of that meeting in Dallas in 2007 was people's waiting time, which has a certain logic to it that if you've waited longer, eventually you should get to the top of the list. But it also missed some opportunities to maximize or at least to increase benefit. And so back to that meeting in Dallas, the idea that they had in Dallas was to save the most life. And roughly in this context, that meant giving each donated kidney to the person who, as near as anyone could figure out, would gain the most years of life, would gain more years of life from receiving that organ than any other candidate. They called this idea LIFT, L-Y-F-T, for life years from transplant. This was, of course, before the era of ride sharing. And the math behind this was really complicated because you have to estimate several things for each person. How long would they survive without a transplant? How long if they receive this kidney now, given their present state of health? And by the way, if they get a transplant and later the transplanted organ, the kidney, failed, how long would they be able to live after that? Because, of course, they could go back on dialysis. So each of those questions had an intricate, debatable, quantitative model behind it. Stepping back, the appeal of saving the most life at a values level seems to have been particularly strong for medical experts. Years later, I interviewed people who were part of the small working group that had developed LIFT. And I found real passion still in the voices of the doctors who had worked on this, telling me about the virtues of this idea of saving the most life. And it's also reflected in published debates from the period, some of which I pick up in the book. One might locate the enthusiasm for this idea of maximizing total benefit, at least in part, in the values that people are socialized into in the course of gaining medical expertise, right? Being a doctor is not just about knowing certain things. It's about doing certain things and professing certain values. And the Hippocratic ethic is often phrased in terms of doing benefit for each patient, trying to get perhaps the most benefit for your current patient, right? Not thinking about one patient as more or less deserving than any other. So there was a certain moral logic to saying a year of life is a year of life, and it's equally valuable, no matter who gets to live it. And if we can make more years of life in total, that's better than fewer. And the promise was a lot more years of life. If the forecasts were right, then in each year where the new system was in effect, it would save more than 10,000 additional years of life across the United States relative to the old way of giving out organs. But of course, LIFT would not only change how many years of life the transplant system created, it would also change who gets to live those years. Here's a graph. Now, I want to point out a couple of things. So this is from this presentation in Dallas, where the experts brought a public meeting together and said, here's what we're thinking of doing. Here's how it would work. And if you look here, this medallion at the bottom of this graph says Scientific Registry of Transplant Recipients. There are a lot of conversations today about auditing of algorithms, the idea that a third party should come in, kick the tires, tell you how something's really working. That's what this is. The Scientific Registry of Transplant Recipients is a separate body from the United Network for Organ Sharing. So UNOS, as it's known, ran the meeting, runs the transplant system, operates the algorithm. SRTR, this auditing body, their job is, as an outsider, to record all the outcomes, analyze performance, forecast how possible changes might impact the system, which, you'll hear this term impact assessment often used. And the idea there, it can sound like something, whenever I hear impact assessment, I think of like those crash reports after a plane goes down. It sounds like something that happens after the impact, but in fact, it's actually a byword for a kind of forecast. The idea is to anticipate, if we use a new system, what will be the consequences and what can we learn? And that's what they're doing here. So although it doesn't say AI ethics on the tin, it's very much the same set of practices. And so what you see here in the pink with the diamonds is the current rules. And the proposed new system, LIFT, is depicted with these teal squares. And so the question is, how old is the recipient? And you see this in bands of 10 years. So it turns out if you want to maximize the number of additional years of life that you generate, one good way to do that is by giving organs to younger patients who, in general, if restored to health, have more years in front of them than older recipients do. And so if you see here what the differences would be if this proposal were implemented. So the fraction, and these numbers on the graph are the fraction of all transplants going to people in that age band. So for instance, the existing system was giving 7% of all transplants to people in their 20s. The new system would give 23% of all transplants to people in their 20s. That's what's here. So it would triple the fraction of transplants going to people in their 20s. On the other hand, by the same token, the fraction of transplants going to people in their 50s would fall by half, from 27 to 14%. And I want to take us to a very specific moment just after noon in this Dallas meeting. The expert presentations are over, the details have been laid out, and it's time for members of the public to weigh in. And a man named Clive Raw takes to the stage. Clive is not, he's the first person without an MD or a PhD to speak to this audience. He's a traffic engineer from Los Angeles. His kidneys are on the brink of failure. He has a rare genetic disease called polycystic kidney disease, or PKD, which you see mentioned there. And he actually leads the local LA chapter of a patient organization for people with this condition. People with this disease can live with their natural kidneys for many years, but eventually PKD patients who live long enough will need a transplant, or else, like other people with kidney failure, they'll have to rely on the risky and life-dominating ritual of dialysis to stay alive from one day to the next. Understandably, Clive is focused here on the big picture and not the details. He only has 5 minutes to make his case, And he starts out with a methodological objection against the new system, one that actually leaves it unclear whether or not he fully understands what's being proposed. His first objection, he says, age isn't always a good proxy for health. Sometimes a candidate in their 50s would actually live longer with a transplant than one in their 40s. Clive seems to think that the doctors and data scientists are proposing to use age as a bright line so that younger patients would always come first. The actual formula was more complicated than a bright line. Age was the most important factor for most candidates. But there were other factors, such as, for example, whether the person had diabetes. And sometimes the formula would actually favor a healthier candidate who was older, even one in their 50s, over a less healthy candidate in their 40s. So you can imagine the experts proposing the new system might want to dismiss what Clive was saying. Because if we really want to be exacting about the details here, he's wrong. But having studied this and having interviewed Clive a number of times over the last few years, I think that even if his perspective was wrong on some key details, he was right on the gist. If he'd had a team of data experts helping him to prepare for this moment, they probably would have given essentially the same objection in a slightly sharpened form. Sure, there are no bright lines based on age, but age is being used as a proxy for health, partly because the system doesn't have more detailed data, for example, about each candidate's heart health or even things like their lifestyle. And one might think that's not fair, that the fair thing to do would be to go out and gather more data. As Clive put it, getting a transplant, that's the methodological point. But the deeper point that Clive was making was a moral one. Because what he was saying, as he put it, getting a transplant is something I prepared for by taking care of my health for 50 plus years. To not get one now is demoralizing and seems unfair. He also pointed out it would have a perverse incentive for people like his daughter, who also suffers from the same disease, because she might benefit if her health declined faster and she needed a kidney when younger, right? If she takes good care of herself and pushes out in time the moment when she needs a kidney until a moment when she is older, then under the proposed lift system, that might be to her disadvantage, even though in general, if you can reduce demand, it's good for the world. Anyway, it wasn't just Clive. What people noticed was that this idea of maximizing benefit had other problems with it that hadn't apparently loomed as large for the technical experts as it did for members of the public. So, we're in the United States here. Who's healthier than others? I just saw that I put my coffee down some. If someone from our capable AV team could bring water or something, I'd appreciate it. Or no, I left it over there. What did I do? Thanks, guys. Sorry about that. The people noticed that the whole system is designed to favor healthier candidates. And in the United States, who's healthier? People of means are healthier. People with better access to medical care. And, so yeah, younger people are healthier, but there's a race equity component to this, right? The group of people who are in relatively better health are on average whiter. Meanwhile, what causes people to have kidney failure and need a kidney in the first place? It turns out social determinants of health are a huge piece of that. Thank you so much. The rate of kidney failure is 3 or 4 times as high in the African American community as in the white community in the United States. And why is that? It's because socially determined health conditions like diabetes, high blood pressure, even stress are important contributors to kidney disease. So if they had pursued this original proposal, the thing the experts wanted, and as I mentioned earlier, the thing that years later, when I talked to physicians who had worked on this and data scientists and others, people had a really vivid, really strong sense that this, in the technical community, that this would have been the right move. But it didn't carry the day. What happened instead was compromise. In the end, Lyft was scrapped. And the algorithm that was implemented instead, the one that we have today, strikes more of a balance, offering the healthiest of the kidneys to patients who are likely to live the longest, while still giving the rest of the waiting list a reasonable chance to receive other organs. So compared with what came before, this does increase the total amount of life saved. But it also improves race equity and keeps the door open for older patients to get transplants. And so I'm spoiling for you a decade of debate that led to that outcome. Here's an example. This is 2009, so 2 years after Dallas. You have the main journal of record for the transplant community. Equity was the idea of giving everyone an equal or a fair chance. Utility, the idea of maximizing life years in this conversation. And as you can see, there was a vivid and a big debate here. But in the end, there was compromise. I thought, right. Let's see. So this is just one. So there's an annual, extremely detailed, extremely readable audit of the kidney transplant system produced by that SRTR group that I mentioned earlier. And here you can see one indicator. This is, so by race of the person on the waiting list per month, what is the likelihood that the person gets an organ? So what you would hope for here, if the conditions were ideally equitable, is that these various lines would be at the same point on the y-axis. And as you can see, 2014, the new system comes in, a convergence begins to take place. And it's a complicated story. There were a bunch of other changes that were happening concurrently, like, for example, the way that waiting time was calculated. The old way was you get priority from whenever you join the list, and people with better medical care access would join the list earlier in the course of their disease, whereas others might never find out that they were a candidate for transplant or not become a candidate until further along in the course of their disease. So under the new system, in order to partly compensate for that, you get priority from when you join the list or when your dialysis treatment begins, whichever is earlier, which meant that for people who had less access to care and might be joining later in the course of their disease, they had more priority under the new system. So that's just one small example. I mean, as you can see here, this is the 13th in this series of charts from that particular year of analyzing things. So, I mean, we could go into a lot of depth. I go into a bit more in the book than I can this morning, but just to show you, there's a lot of careful analysis and infrastructure there to do this kind of thinking. So, all right, enough about transplant as such. You came here not because of your interest in medicine, but because I can only assume of your interest in AI and its governance, which is, of course, the interest with which I began to explore this material. I said, this is worth looking at because, as Ashish mentioned in his very kind introduction, there are not very many examples of systems governed that well. And there are many examples of systems governed poorly. I'd worked on some of those in my time in civil rights. So, courtroom systems where the training data didn't match the domain of application and where the clinical experts, in that case, justice system experts like judges, didn't understand how the system worked. We've seen things certainly in the educational domain, school assignment algorithms, other things where people who ought to understand and ought to have a voice don't or can't. This seemed like it was better, But the transplant that I ultimately cared about was not a kidney transplant, but kind of a process transplant of how do we get the values right inside of software from this medical context into other high stakes social domains. And so I looked at 4 strategies that are often suggested for ethical approaches to AI. And of course, in this attempt to transplant lessons from this context to others, there will be no perfect matches because kidney transplantation is unique in some respects. Organs, for example, are a non-market good. But I would say that there are 4 strategies that happened in this case and are suggested in many other cases: participation, transparency, forecasting, or impact statements, if you want to call it that, and auditing. And those techniques are each under discussion because scholars and policymakers at places like this one and elsewhere have decided that those may be useful across a range of high-stakes algorithms. And so if you care about any of those techniques, I think there are lessons here. And in particular, I think the lessons from this case might be useful in contexts where public confidence is important. Public trust is hard to gain, it's easy to lose, and it's very useful. It matters not only for government, but also for high-stakes private sector systems, for software used in things like hiring, insurance, and lending. Proving correctness to regulators and building confidence among customers and the public are perennial challenges. So transparency and auditing in particular may be indicated when public confidence seems to be at stake. Secondly, rationing problems. Just as there are only so many kidneys available for transplant, there are only so many seats available in a public school. When a resource is public, there's a strong presumption that a broad polity should help to decide how it is shared. And in some cases, there may be a question, of course, about whether or not to regard the supply of a resource as fixed. For example, there's great work by my colleague in the broader field, Virginia Eubanks, about homelessness. And there was an algorithm in Los Angeles to allocate the homeless beds. And a huge amount of attention was poured into refining this algorithm. And one of the points that Professor Eubanks quite sensibly makes is, hang on, maybe we should spend some of that money building more beds and not focusing so much on the allocation. So that is, of course, part of the calculus. Nonetheless, we don't have infinite resources. And so allocating resources in conscionable, tolerable, and perfect ways is a really important thing to be able to do. And then I would say the lessons from this story are useful in contexts where we don't think that the way we've been trying things is working very well. So in some places, traditional institutions seem to be capable of governing high-stakes algorithms effectively. For instance, opinions vary, but you might think that what happened just this past weekend with Silicon Valley Bank showed that we know how to address and contain those risks. I suppose the jury is probably out at this moment. But there's a whole elaborate infrastructure, actually, of what's called model risk management, not for the particular risk that went wrong there, but for other bank risks. There's a careful set of processes that have been developed. There's been interesting work about insurance pricing, saying that your insurance premiums shouldn't be higher if the reason why you're at higher risk is, for instance, because you are serving in the military and or are a veteran. And so there are statutory exclusions from the factors that are allowed to escalate. Actually, Barbara Kiviat, who's here, is the person whose work I'm thinking of. She's in the sociology department. So there are some cases where things work relatively well, and others, like the ones I mentioned a moment ago, where it seems like we could do better. So the question is how. All right. So what can we learn from this story that might be applicable to other domains? First, algorithms shift our moral attention. The architecture of a proposed algorithm often depends in part, in practice, on practical factors like which data is available, which factors are we able to consider, and that architecture in turn influences the terms of ethical debate. 2, participation creates opinions. When I first started this work, I was thinking of public, deliberative, and participatory processes more or less like a kind of extractive exercise or a measurement exercise. You go out and elicit from people what are their preferences, and then you add up all those preferences or something and somehow create something that's a compromise among them. And what happened here was much more organic and much more interesting, actually, which was that people had a conversation, people listened to each other, people's opinions gradually changed over time. One analogy, not to mix my organics, inorganics here, but one analogy that I found useful was the idea of a rock tumbler, like they use to polish things, where things tumble together and the sharp edges are worn away, and you end up with something a little softer, a little gentler, and maybe that shines a little more. That's what happened in this case. Third, shared understanding of the moral consequences of doing one thing or another is not something that you can create just by disclosing the source code or the technical details that are necessary for the experts to use. There is a separate challenge, which is if someone is not an expert, how do you bring them up to speed? And mere disclosure, where technical details are dumped on the public, but people can't really understand what is at stake unless they are an expert or can hire one, that is, as a practical matter, not a very inclusive approach. What happens here is that an elaborate infrastructure of bringing people up to speed, bringing people to the table, right, bringing them together is created at public expense. And you might say, look, better to have everyone do their own analysis because who knows whether the auditor or the analyst can be trusted. After all, everyone has their own incentives, and whoever it is who's doing, for example, the analysis of the racial equity impact of the algorithm may have their own axe to grind. And that is true, and that is a risk. But in working on this, I came to the view that even though that risk is real, and even though it is also important that the underlying data be available so that independent third-party analyses can occur when motivated and resourced actors wish to conduct them, that most people aren't going to have the wherewithal to reproduce such analyses. And so it's very important that at public expense and shared across all of us, some basic effort to understand what's really going on be shared and be conducted. Or as Oscar Wilde is widely, if falsely reputed, once to have said, socialism will never work because there aren't enough evenings in the week, right? The idea that people, particularly people who are in some way marginalized or whose voices might be otherwise excluded, are going to be running their own analyses should not be part of our baseline necessarily assumptions here. Relatedly, deliberation is costly. It takes a long time. It took 10 years in this case. And the bottom line assessment of the goodness or badness of a particular proposal can't be rendered at a very high level of abstraction. It matters how the details fit together. And so, getting people to really understand what's at stake and what's possible both requires the infrastructure to kind of allow someone who's not an expert to understand what the stakes are, but also it's time consuming, it's frustrating, which means that it's not something we do every day or for everything, or could or should do every day or for everything, right? There's a real strategic choice where you're spending resources to have participation occur. Fifth, quantification can be a moral anesthetic. What do I mean by that? If we really look hard at the fact that there aren't enough organs to go around, whether we're talking, as we are in this case, about kidneys, or we're talking about organs that don't have something like dialysis available, like hearts or livers, for example, we really are deciding who lives and who dies. And nobody deserves to die because they can't get an organ. And so there's a literature on what are called tragic choices, of which this is one. Calabresi and Bobbitt from the 70s are the originators of that literature. And the idea is that we do a lot of things in life inevitably that are painful or are ugly, and we peel back the curtain and deliberate about those things at some psychological cost. And we do that when doing it can help us to make the world better. So the conventional thing in sort of science and technology study circles to say about this is to observe, the fact that it seems authoritative and sort of amoral is a problem and is bad. And it can be a problem and it can be bad. But I think there is also, at the same time, equally a way in which authoritative quantitative scoring can be merciful, when the sad truth is we can't do right by everyone, and we need to live under a system where the choices are tolerable, even though the suffering is great. And finally, knowledge and participation don't always mean power. There's a kind of a coda to the story of this development of this careful system that balances all of these interests, which is that it turns out there were still some great degrees of unfairness related to the geography of the system, which later were resolved through a lawsuit that was successful, and within the course of a week remade some of the underlying geographic assumptions of the system, which is to say, you create some new process or some new group or some new way of making sure that the values inside of your technology are ethical. Whatever it is that's newly created is ultimately going to be subservient to the top level of ways that we coordinate and control our activities and our lives, which include things like Supreme Court rulings, executive branch actions, and legislation, all of which are additional avenues of people trying to change things in the midst of all of this special purpose algorithmic governance that we might be tempted to spin up in any of the contexts that we study. So I'll end there. Look forward to your questions.
Which was also on time. We're going to intersperse questions from the audience with questions which came online. If you have a question, if you could just please raise your hands up and then walk up to the mic. Okay. Go ahead. Go to the mic. Can you go to the mic, please, to ask your question?
This way our friends on Zoom will hear.
Thank you for great presentation. I'm so intrigued by what you asking to us. You briefly mentioned about the 4 strategies to how to create more equitable systems, like you mentioned, to create an impact or forecast or something around that. Could you unpack that, like those strategies, a little bit more?
Yeah, so I think there are many ways of mapping the whole space of different practices that we can use to make software. And this is a whole other thing. About what are we even talking? What's the scope technologically, what we're talking about? So, of course, AI can have a term of art meaning among technical experts. At the same time, descriptively speaking, the way that the term is now being used by policymakers is as a synonym for important software. That is, making choices that we feel like need to be regulated in some way. And the earlier term for this was big data, and there were earlier terms before that for kind of whatever technology seems to need careful governance. And I do think it's important not to predicate the involvement of lay people on details of the technology which are visible only to experts. So, for example, if you say, well, we need public participatory processes to deal with, opaque neural networks or something like that, where the public can't know which things those are unless some expert tells them. That I don't think is a promising avenue. So I sort of, my thought is that for purposes of involving lay people, we ought to meet the public where it is in terms of saying if software is important, if it's deciding something that shapes and impacts your life, then that's the kind of reason we're going to use to decide whether you need to be part of the process or should have claim to be part of the process. And then I split it 4 ways. There are other ways certainly that people could think about this, but I think about it in terms of participation of people. I think about it in terms of transparency. I think about it in terms of forecasting or impact statements, which is where we're looking ahead and trying to say, what would this do if we put it out in the world? And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, we're looking at auditing. So, okay, we put it out in the world, then what happened, right? And that's a real tell if you see a system being deployed in some consequential way where there's not a careful plan to pay attention to what its consequences actually are. That's a real concern.
An online question. Values and ethics are thought about differently in different parts of the globe. When adding ethics and values to AI, any thoughts about how to do this in a global context?
Yeah, so I mean, you could ask, is this the same question as we face in non-AI contexts with global differences in values and ethics? Or is there something distinctive about doing this in the context of technology? I mean, I think one answer is that the software tools, the frameworks that we use across the world are perhaps more coordinated or more similar than the laws, right? We have lots of localization of what the laws are in different places. We have senses of different polities, although I don't want to leap to conclusions about how many people globally live in what we would call a representative government that can be said to kind of reflect their input. But I think that it's a similar problem to the one that would exist in non-technological contexts, and it is a hard one. I think the overall premise of democratic methods is that people have an inherent dignity, and I mean there are many different glosses, but I would gloss it as the idea is that people have an inherent dignity, and to the extent that they're being deeply impacted or their lives are affected by something, they ought to have some voice. And there are, special cases. There are people who can't speak for themselves. What do we do about people who are temporary members of a certain community? What do we do about children? I mean, sure, it's complicated, but I do think that a lot of this work comes from the same place that a lot of sort of political reform efforts come from, which is to say that people ought to have, a voice in the rules that shape their lives.
Really useful. Yes, go ahead, sir.
I was wondering whether you studied the market for kidneys, like, in Iran, where you can buy and sell kidneys. Now, what do you think about that? Maybe particularly for the scope of this talk, the software behind that, or how that might.
Yeah. So,
if I may ask a clarificatory question, by the market for kidneys, you mean the abstract market mechanisms for kidneys? Or do you mean people actually selling and buying kidneys with real money?
Sure, he's familiar with it, but in Iran, you can buy and sell kidneys.
And buying and selling kidneys, that's what you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, it does occur. There's a global norm against this. And so Iran is one example of places where the report is that there's a domain that is outside the scope of what is otherwise an unusually strong, I would say, global consensus, back to this point about how much values differ. One value on which a very large fraction of the world has converged is the idea that organs are a non-market commodity, but there are, as you say, some places where that is not the case and where organs can be bought and sold. I think that, I think one reason that markets are very attractive, one virtue that they have for people who like them in situations when we like them, even if organs aren't one of those examples, is that prices are an information mechanism. They save us from having to explicitly make values choices. So in other words, instead of deciding who can live near where they work in Silicon Valley, we just have prices. And we've decided that's the fair way to figure out, who can live where. And it's simpler. And it's better if you have a lot of money and only care about what you yourself are able to get. But it's less fair in some settings, and this is one of those. So, but I'll say one other thing about this, which is it's not a completely dichotomous situation between we either have a completely unfettered market or we have no incentives for healthy people to donate kidneys. For example, one of the possibilities that is intermediate is to have what's known as a centralized single compensator. So we don't have an open market, but the government says kidneys save lives, they're really valuable, and lots of people are healthy and have an extra one. We will do things to incentivize people to donate. And those might be like, there have been proposals like we'll put funds in a trust and pay for your education if you donate. I'm not going to take a view about which of those proposals, if any, ought to be implemented. But for example, Sally Satel is a physician and a kidney transplant recipient who's done a lot of work on this. And I think it's at least the case that it's not completely obvious that there's nothing to be done in this middle area between the unfettered market and the no incentives at all zone that we currently in the US inhabit.
That's the distinction I was getting at when I asked you to clarify whether by market mechanisms you mean just buying and selling. Thanks for making that distinction. I'm going to combine two questions into one. I'm going to just read them one after the other and then with some commentary, and then maybe ask you to respond. The first question is, policy goals often seem fuzzy and come from complicated political compromises. Machine learning models optimize a precise outcome goal. How can we bridge this gap? And the second question in the same vein is not so much from political compromises, but even from a normative point of view. Not just what we think politically, but normatively. I have a hard time understanding why maximizing life years is not equitable. That sounds a priori fair, but to use this question seems more technical. So for example, if you're looking at it from a Rawlsian veil of ignorance, where you're given a child who's 10 years old, and this child is going to get kidney disease at either 30 or 60. And you are asked to decide whether the 30-year-old child should get the kidney or the 60-year-old child should get the kidney. You might say, well, it's equitable to give the kidney to the 30-year-old. And so it's not the use of the word equity to describe one kind of process seems debatable. I'm not saying your definition of equity was correct. It's debatable. Mm-hmm. And what both these questions seem to be getting at is that if you are, for example, a software designer or a developer or a data scientist who's making a decision, let's say, about assigning credit, there's this discouraging thought at the beginning that no matter what you do, this thing that you're building is going to be vehemently criticized on the basis of equity or being not being held up to the highest ethical standards. And what would you say to someone who's trying to reconcile these things?
Yeah. So a couple of things. One, the idea that there's a fact of the matter about what the equitable approach is, and that if we only do the technical part right, then we're going to live in a world of blissful agreement about how things ought to be executed is, of course, when stated in that form, which is only a slight cartoon, a fantasy. That's not how things work. People have different beliefs about what's fair. I'll also agree vehemently with the person who said that, as I'm recalling from a moment ago, that maximizing life years seems a priori fair. It absolutely does seem a priori fair. But we don't live in an a priori world. We live in a complicated world where, for example, the etiologies that cause people to need kidneys are partly determined by their biology and are also partly determined by past patterns of social practice, including social injustice, which in a pure life year maximization world, we choose to ignore, right? We say it doesn't matter why you need a kidney. It doesn't matter whether you had a fair shot in the first place. It doesn't matter whether you're a less efficient converter of kidneys into life years, because even now we don't give you decent health care. Sure. One simplifying thing we could do is ignore all of that. And perhaps someone might say that we ought to. But to the idea of what's a priori obvious, it's certainly not a priori obvious that we ought to ignore all that stuff.
Just to push this idea a little bit more and reviving the first of the two questions, which was that machine learning models optimize a precise outcome goal.
Yes.
If we translate that into machine learning, algorithms will give an answer, credit or no credit.
Right.
And the concern here is not that the issues are complex, and there's no the concern here is that anything that gives an answer is going to be open to retroactive criticism, just by the very fact that it's giving an answer, and answers are not perfect.
Yes. Yes. And indeed, in that sense, there's a sense in which everyone is a critic. Any outcome can be criticized, right? And this is actually one reason why I was attracted to writing a book about this example, is that it's far easier to say what's wrong than it is to say, even with a flawed thing, and there are plenty of flaws in this story, but there are also things here to admire. And I think dispositionally, I like to both see flaws in things, but also see what's admirable and even something that isn't perfect. But to the point about, okay, yes, there has to be an exact operationalization, and there's a discrete choice to make about, e.g., whether to extend a loan or on what terms. So, of course, the question of what terms to offer is not binary. There are all kinds of dials there. But you have, I think, you have the metrics that are operationalized, and then you have the question of, okay, how well do these metrics map onto the normative import of what we're doing? And often the answer is, well, partly, but not perfectly. They map on to what we really care about. And so I think part of this, actually, to this point about integrating liberal arts with technology, part of it is about saying, here's our quantitative model. It's the best feasible thing we're able to do right now. And here is the limit of that, or here's what's not encapsulated in that data. I actually think some of the most interesting practical work about how to adapt the engineering practices, there's been excellent research about this recently, is what can we do to encapsulate the tacit knowledge that an engineering team might have about what's omitted from the data, or it was gathered for this, but now we're using it over here for that. Here's what's different. Or this model works well in this domain, but we're concerned that it wouldn't work well in this other foreseeable use case. And so there are these ideas like model cards or data sheets for data sets that are like, what can we do so that knowledge travels where the technology travels? I'm excited by that.
I must acknowledge that just to say what I said at the beginning, it is actually rare for an ethicist or a philosopher to actually give an illustrative positive examples. Thank you very much. And also, if I may paraphrase your answer, what you're saying is that perfection is hard, but transparency, auditing, consultation, deliberation are easy. Or not easy, but at least feasible.
They're feasible.
So at least let's start with that. Thank you. Go ahead, ma'am.
Good morning. Thanks, David, for your talk. Jen King, I'm the Privacy and Data Policy Fellow here at HI. I am curious what your experience taught you about transparency and explainability. Just for context, in my work, I'm looking at this a lot, looking across different definitions of ADM in policy. I'm working with Stanford students here doing that. And one of the things you see repeated over and over are, basically insisted in policy that you're going to have transparency and you're going to have explainability, like, kind of no exceptions. But I'm extremely skeptical about how we're going to achieve this, not only because of what we see with the kind of technical capacity of AI, from my own background in privacy, where we've had demands of explainability with privacy policies for 30 plus years now. And, they don't do what they say they're going to do, and they don't communicate to consumers. And now we're talking about something I think that's even far more technical and complex than we're even dealing with in kind of the privacy space to date. So I'm just curious, do you have any learnings from what this experience taught you? I think that would be helpful. Or do you also have your own skepticism about how we're going to accomplish this? Thanks.
So let me start by validating that this is really hard, and we're lucky to have people thinking hard about and probably could use more work on this area. I think when you legally mandate something, there's always that you think is good. The virtue is that you'll get more of whatever it is because people obey laws often. But then the other side of it is that whatever people do, they're going to define as satisfying. Whatever. So, for example, what counts as an explanation, or what makes something transparent? We're going to get operationalizations of those ideas that are feasible for people to do, so that we don't end up in a world where we're saying fulfillment of the legal requirement is not possible, because that's not what someone wants to say. They don't want to say, I broke the law, I couldn't do otherwise. They want to say, I provided an explanation. Here's what an explanation is. And, it might be. So I think it's very complicated because, you could have this complicated, I know I'm going over material here where you would know it better even than I, but it brings to mind for me the reality that it's one thing to say, okay, each decision is caused by a simple list of factors. Explain why did I get, not get a loan? Well, there are 5 factors and here were the inputs and here's the output, and the machine is simple. But maybe what you really mean is, why is it those factors and how did the machine get created? And their explanations are much harder, perhaps, to come by. And so I think when, legislation, policymaking this area is really hard. Technologists are writing with a whiteboard, and, in legislation, it's more analogous to using a chisel. You can only do it, every few decades or something. You don't know exactly how the technology is going to change under. So, and this was something, if Peter's still here, that he was pointing out earlier about high-level principle statements, was they're so high level and so abstract that they don't actually instruct often on what to do. On the other hand, you can get very, very specific, but then the technology changes and it doesn't work well. And so in my mind, and this goes, Ashish, to something that you mentioned yesterday when we were chatting as well, the challenge of implementing something that is bringing ethical and policy considerations to bear in an engineering setting in a way that operates and works, the central challenge there, I think, is figuring out a level of abstraction where you're not so up in the clouds that it's essentially unrelated to what you're actually having to decide to do, but you're also not so down in the details that you're sort of stuck and not applicable.
Time for one last question. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. My name's Greg Amadon. I'm a Stanford alum. Thank you, David, for your talk. I was curious if Congress mandated some kind of accountability as to civil rights. How would the industry supply that data back based on their algorithms?
So, this is a question that exists in non-AI contexts where there's, for example, fair housing requirements, and there are different ways that that's done. There's testing that people go in and try and rent an apartment and see if 2 people who differ in race and are otherwise similarly situated get the same answer or a different answer. So there are those pieces. I do think this question of how data comes in and how that interacts is particularly in corporate settings. It's complicated. I think the book is about a public sector case, and a lot of the concern, not all the public concern, but there's a significant amount of this that's about public sector applications. And in those cases, even when you have a commercial actor coming in, for example, to furnish software to the police department to assess who's dangerous or something like that, in those settings, I think that transparency of the kind we would expect if the government had built the thing itself may well be advisable. And we might just want to say, well, that's just part of the price of doing that kind of business, is that you have to be very, very open about what you've built.
Thank you very much, David. Thanks for giving a great talk, but also really listening to what questions we had to ask, giving answers which were clarifying. Definitely, I found them personally clarifying. So let's all thank David again.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.